Hello and welcome back to Quality Policing, intermittent podcast that I do whenever there's a good reason to do one, and I think now is a good reason. I am Peter Moskos, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm here today with René Ropac and Stephen Koppel, and they are both senior research associates at the Data Collaborative for Justice, also at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. We're really knocking it out of the park this time. And you both were graciously agreed to come on to help explain to me and the dozens of other listeners or viewers about bail reform. You guys are responsible now for 5 reports looking at New York City bail reform that took effect, passed in 2019 and took effect in late 2019 and in 2020. And bail reform, and correct me anything I say wrong here because you know better than I do, but bail reform is often, it was a big bill, to put it mildly, and it had 3 main elements. The part that specifically dealt with bail reform, which we'll get back to. It also had big changes in discovery reform when prosecutors and what prosecutors have to turn over to the defense team, and also some speedy trial provisions that we won't kind of get into, but that, as far as I know, basically limited how often prosecution can stop the clock in trials. But there was so the 4th report was released in October, the 5th report in November. I'm personally more interested in the 4th report, though I think they overlap or dovetail nicely. The 5th report looks at outside New York City, and it's interesting that there are different effects. The 4th report looks in New York City, and the reason we sort of got together, I mean, René, you've been on this podcast before, so thanks for coming back. There was some online, it's funny how it took a month for it to sort of reach social media, or I mean, not a month, but a week or 2 or 3. Bail reform works, I kept seeing from progressive politicians. And I thought that's a weird thing to say because, first of all, it's too big to say that something bail reform works or doesn't work. There's nuance. And they were very selectively highlighting parts of the executive summary or conclusion and ignoring the next paragraph, which struck me as a bit disingenuous. But if you maybe could just summarize what the findings are and put some context in this for people who are mildly curious about bail reform and don't want to read the report, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, New York law, only allows judges to consider the risk of missing court appearances when they make release decisions.
Every state in the union in DC allows judges to determine if this person is dangerous. Sometimes there's a formal, standard or metrics. Other times I imagine it's more discretionary. So that is expressly forbidden in New York. Now, it always has been, but there were workarounds before bail reform. And so those workarounds have been closed. So that's a sort of a separate issue that people are like, why are these dangerous people being released? But that's not the point of your study. And so.
Yeah, no, I mean, let's maybe talk about this a couple of minutes before I go into the studies, because I think it is an important context. For what it's worth, and maybe, that's my interpretation of the data. I don't have real evidence, like I can't prove this, but I think it's pretty obvious when you look at release decisions, especially for violent felonies, which are, again, almost all of them are still eligible for bail. When you look at release decisions in New York City and outside of New York City, you see that judges outside of the city release way fewer of those violent felonies. So in other words, they and violent felonies, by the way, have the lowest rates of failure to appear in court. So if we really go with the premise that judges only consider failure to appear in court with their release decisions, I think the empirical data, kind of challenges that perception, because again, like we have violent felonies who have very low FTA rates. FTA is failure to appear compared to misdemeanors and non-violent felonies, and yet they're held a lot more often, and they're held more often outside of the city by quite a margin than in the city. So in other words, you have different judicial cultures, different, in the city and outside of the city, and that kind of seems to interact with the law.
You make a big distinction between low risk and high risk subgroups.
We basically compare two different groups. We compare people who were released without bail, and we compare that to statistically similar people who were held on bail, or who who faced bail or were remanded. Did what was stipulated by bail reform proponents actually happen? And I guess it did in the aggregate. The other part of the story, which should not be overlooked, is the detrimental effects among high-risk individuals. And again, across
before you get into that, if I could just elaborate a little bit on, why perhaps recidivism went down when people not detained with bail. If you get arrested and detained, you might get fired. A relationship might break up.
And because of that, future offending may become more likely once people are released again. So that's called the criminogenic effect. And that is arguably a stronger effect for people who are first-time offenders. They're arrested for the first time. They might still have a job. They might have still intact family connections. There's a lot to lose, right? On the other hand, recidivism under reform may increase because, there's no incapacitation, right? Like people aren't locked up, so they have an immediate opportunity to reoffend rather than being locked up for several days or even weeks, which kind of introduces a delay. And on top of that, there might be a lack of a deterrent effect, right? People might be more likely to offend if they think that they won't be held pre-trial. So those are kind of the countervailing forces behind our results. And what we see is that, among those high-risk individuals, we see recidivism increases because, as I said, there's probably not much criminogenic effect left for someone who has been arrested several times or who has a history of violent felonies. But incapacitation matters quite a bit, and perhaps deterrence also matters. The criminogenic effects are stronger among the low-risk individuals, and the incapacitation effects are stronger among those types of high-risk individuals.
So, the key distinction here seems to be among basically the frequent super recidivists. Bail reform seems to have failed on us. Especially the more violent ones.
Something like, people with recent prior violent felony arrests is about 15% of the sample.
The reason this strikes me so important is because you have identified the group for whom bail reform has failed. There it is. It's that group. And it seems like the law could be changed to specifically address that group.
That's right. So in a way, like the July 2020 amendments, as I already mentioned, they reintroduced bail eligibility for certain cases, and we actually looked at the impact of those amendments, and they did reduce recidivism among those cases that were becoming bail eligible once again in July. The issue is that even after those amendments were passed, and that's what our study shows with the 50-month follow-up period, is that we still see increased recidivism rates for people with recent prior arrests. Those amendments had probably in spirit something that you just mentioned. Why not address those high-risk individuals? But I think they didn't fully address the problem. They solved the problem at the margins, but we still see those increased recidivism rates among people with recent criminal histories, despite those amendments.
How would you change this law to specifically to take care of the group that recidivism has increased? What should it say?
I think there's a menu of options. So you could perhaps say, okay, we provide more intense pretrial services, maybe where people have more consequences if there's pretrial misconduct or something like that. That's the menu of options, I think. You can provide more pretrial services for those who are released, or you can reduce the number of people who are released based on some type of, risk assessment or release assessment. Or the third option, which again is not mutually exclusive with the other two, is, as you say, you could allow a dangerousness consideration, even though personally I'm fairly skeptical that would change the equation all that much. I think normatively it makes sense, but empirically I would be surprised if it really changes release behavior or traditional decision making all that much.
And there's some bad case in the New York Post, and they'll get that guy, and we're going to see, is he going to have 10 or 30, prior arrests and 4 felony convictions. And not only, do I think that's morally wrong, it very much is used to sap support for other reforms that are beneficial. Like, it seems like advocates of bail reform should be much more concerned about the...
Right, yeah, there would be a public safety benefit to addressing this one way or another, and there would also be a PR benefit, if you will, for bail reform, right? It's like it would take a lot of wind out of the sails of the New York Post writers, for example, if the types of people that are appearing in story after story were actually eligible for bail.
So where can we go from here? I think there are two approaches, at least. One is to, on an ad hoc basis, continue to add categories. So we find that people with prior convictions are also at higher risk. So now we add some flexibility, and judges consider that category now. But we still have other categories. I think we're sort of eating away at the corners here, but there's still always going to be other exceptions. And in the absence of the ability to consider all factors, we may still have issues. I think one way to address that, this is the other component of it, is that instead of allowing judges to consider all factors under the sun without any evidence for consider those factors, we can move towards a system where dangerousness or pretrial recidivism is directly considered through a risk assessment tool. And by doing so, you could potentially guide judges towards the factors that matter the most.
So when you see people just take your reports and say, yep, you have proven that bail reform works, do you tear your hair out?
I've noticed this from both sides of the spectrum. Like, people will cherry pick the results that support their views or their agenda the most, right? And I'm beyond pulling my hair out. Like, it's not really I'm pulling my hair out. It's just something that I suppose I somewhat accepted as the nature of the political discourse.
At the national level, one thing I bristle at is generalizations about bail reform. I mean, the range of bail reforms that have been implemented across the United States has been enormous, and it's included very mild discretionary reforms where, for example, prosecutors stop requesting bail. That's a bail reform. We've had other injunctions of imposing just bail for certain types of offenses, but at the same time, pretrial detention is allowed for those individuals. So there's always a backdoor to detain people who are at high risk. There are often comparisons to New Jersey. New Jersey, through a raft of reforms, effectively eliminated money bail, but still detains roughly 20% of people pre-trial based on risk. So there's a range of options, and making generalizations about bail reform doesn't capture the nuance of all the types of reforms that have been undertaken in the U.S.
You can focus on the high-risk individuals and talk about recidivism rates. But what we also found is for certain subgroups, we found no changes in recidivism rates, but we found increases in the frequency of subsequent arrests. And that basically means we found that fewer people were rearrested, but among those who were rearrested, those were rearrested more often throughout the tracking period, which kind of speaks to this repeat offending issue.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are disturbingly, we're talking about violent felonies here. They're scary. Any rearrest is, in 80+%, felony arrest 70%. Violent felony rearrest has gone up to 46%. I mean, that's a lot of people being hurt out there. And yeah, and we can identify the group. I mean, that's why I emphasize this is not to sound like a New York Post headline, but to say, wow, this could be fixed.
That's right. And for what it's worth, among the low-risk individuals, you saw decreases in violent felony recidivism as well. And I think that's just an important context. Like, not only did we quote unquote gain violent felony rearrests among the high risk people, we actually also spared ourselves from violent felony reoffenses among the low risk people. So that's why we, in the aggregate, we kind of find no effects in either direction for the most part, or even decreases in New York, because there's way more low risk people than high risk people. But that being said, yes, you're right. If I think any violent crime that's been committed is one too many, and if there's a way to address this by identifying the high risk groups in a reliable way and treating them differently than currently to reduce that, I think we should do that. Yeah.
So in the initial bail reform law, there was a requirement that data on bail and risk factors were collected and released. And every 6 months, there's a beautiful public data set online where you can run your own analyses with a fairly rich data set. And I don't think other states that have undertaken reforms like this have been as transparent as New York has.
Okay, thanks again. This is Peter Moskos. I'm here with René Ropac and Stephen Koppel, and they both just released a study for the Data Collaborative for Justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, my own school, and they are senior research associates there. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Peter. Take care.
Bye.